Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course International Studies in Vernacular Architecture. Today we are going to talk about culture, identity and buildings. Before I speak about culture, let us take us a deeper concepts of who we are. So let's start with a very fundamental question of who am I? I'm not the only one who have asked this question. Various scholars, including philosophers like great saints like Ramana Maharshi, who actually talked about who am I? It's talking about taking the self, the body and the mind and relating it to this universe. So it's a very complex phenomenon which is going to be discussed in both anthropological terms and sociological terms. And here we are trying to relate in the studies of vernacular architecture. Let me start with a very basic understanding. When you or me, anyone who is born, what is our identity? We are first identified as an individual, or is it something else which is defining us? The moment we come to this world, the very first identity, that's the very first identity, is our family. Our mother, our father, our relationships with our siblings. So the moment you are born, your first identity is your family. Your son of so and so, or a daughter of so and so, or a grandson of so and so, or the granddaughter of so and so. So this becomes a very first unit of your identity. If you slightly expand this, then immediately there are other things which layers you. What is your religion? Are you a Hindu? Are you a Muslim? Are you a Christian? What is a caste? In countries, some of the developing countries, we talk about the caste, which subcaste you belong to, because you are defined through a particular organizational process. The next layer, which is we are talking about what place we are representing. Are you a native of a small village by name X? Are you a part of a small district? Then obviously it defines a part of a particular state, a country, a continent. So this is how our sense of place is associated not just in a very simple scale, but it expands to from a small room, from a small dwelling to a continent level. So how am I associated with these places? Just who am I? How he is associated with these places? First of all, am I a man? Am I a woman? Am I a transgender? Let's say we say one woman born in Philippines or in Lakshadweep or in Bhutan, which has certain matrilineal processes, which means the inheritance of a property, how it has to be exchanged from one generation to another generation, how the property comes from mother to the daughter, and who after the marriage, who goes from which house to which house. So all these equations will be defined the moment your gender is defined and where you are born. The same woman who was born in Indian mainland will have to go through a different process. The same woman who was born in a country like Philippines, they have to undergo through a different process. So the definitions of their belonging, the definitions of their mobilities, It is all defined with these gender processes. Am I a rich? Am I a poor? Am I religious? Am I atheist? And what caste I do belong to? Am I a Brahmin? Am I a Catholic? Am I a Muslim? Am I a Sikh? So all these layers which defines certain processes, how you lead your life in the next stages. Then when you grow up, what are your political views? Are you a liberal Democrats? Are you a conservationist? What is your views on it? So how do you perceive this world? So your position towards this world view is also important. And most importantly, out of all these, it is someone is telling you that yes, you are a man, you are a woman, you are a rich, you are poor, you are religious, you are atheist. At the same time, you are communicating to them, and you are actually not really an individual here. You are actually a prisoner of an organization or a social institution which has been defined with various cultural geographical context. Now, what is the scale of the space we are talking about? The very first association when you are born, it starts with your home, a simple household, your mother, father. And let us imagine we all have started our life in a very defined continent, very defined political world. Let's take an example of what Tom Hanks have depicted in his movie in Castaway. So he was a FedEx courier person. Unfortunately, he meets with an accident and he found himself in a lone island. There's no human being there, and he himself was a lone survivor there. And he survives there for about 4 years. Now, the whole movie is about, almost the 3/4 movie is all about how he survives in that lone island. So he starts preparing his fire. He starts reinventing his fire. Then he started, finding out how to fish. So he started, almost living a kind of nomadic or a tribal way of life, like where he's just living, hunting the fish, cooking it, and then eating it. So one day, one of the parcel which was missed out in this accident, it comes to the shore, and he finds a small ball, which is a gift, and he takes that ball and he paints it with a small human face, and he names it as a Wilson. And whenever he feels angry, whenever he wants to talk to someone, whenever he wants to share some of his grief or happiness or sorrow, anything, he used to talk to that non-living thing, which is a ball. But he imagines that it is a living thing for him. It is something or someone whom he can cuddle with, whom he can talk with, whom he can become angry with. So this Wilson has been a part of all his 4-year life. And the climax of it, almost towards the end, he finally prepares a small floating ship, floating boat, and then he travels around. And in the middle of his journey, he somehow misses this Wilson. And he really struggles as though his real family member has been missed out. He really struggles to. So that is a kind of intimacy a person has developed with sharing certain things. Though it's just a simple ball, but for him it is someone who took care of him, who was there with him. So this is where he talks about how the Sachs definitions. Places cannot exist without us, but equally important, we cannot exist without place. So until Tom Hanks reaches to this island, there is a sense of place has not been created. So it was a simple space with a natural geographical elements in it. Then he started modifying that particular place for his needs, for his local needs, for his survival needs. So that's how we say a place is a survival instinct. And it is also referred as territorial instinct. how you defines your geographical place, your belonging, your sense of belonging. Let's say when we start about a small home, in the Japanese traditional houses, we have this Japanese tokonoma, which is a kind of sacred space. And here they follow certain practices. Even whenever the guest comes, they try to turn their back towards the tokonoma, so that so they have certain procedures how they make them the guests sit over in this place. So similarly, there's a hierarchical order, the toko bashira, the central wooden post, which it actually segregates certain places, and they display certain font over there, and obviously there are certain display items which are kept in a hierarchical order. So a sacred space starts within a small room. And let me tell you how people are associated with these sacred spaces. It could be a small idol, and how people respond differently. Let's say I tell you one of an important understanding in my own life. I was living in Bhopal, and my mother came to see me, and she was from South India. She lived all her life in the southern part of India, and I was working in central India, and for the first time she traveled and she started staying for a few days with me. And initially I observed she was not very happy. Then I asked her what was the reason. She said, in my hometown, I used to go to a temple, Durga Devi temple, every day, and I'm missing my Durga. So then I found out a small temple which has an idol made of marble, and I showed her, okay, why don't you go to this Durga temple? Then she started going to the temple. But even after a few days, I asked her, why you're still dull? She said, my Durga, which I go regularly, is so furious. She is black in color. But here, I'm not able to associate my Durga here. So which means, that in symbolic expressions are actually, she is linked with that symbolic expressions, whether it is the color of the idol, the furious nature of the idol. Here she says that, for me, the Durga and the Krishna, both of them are smiling. So in that way, I'm not able to relate with what I have seen as a habitual experience from my past. So this is something very important observation. And I try to relate, what Gaston Bachelard talks about, a geographer's Euphu Twan's term called topophilia in the book of Poetics of Space. And that's the life of the mind is given form in the places and spaces in which people dwell, and those places influence human memories, feelings, and thoughts. So it could be a color, it could be a certain semiotic element, but that is how people were associated with it. In the context of Tom Hanks, it was not a living thing, but he was associating as though it was someone who is sharing a life with him. So when we talk about this topophilia, it is a practice that can actively produce places for people. As I said, we all become a kind of prisoners of these social institutions, whether it is a matrilineal society, whether it is a patrilineal society. For example, in Masai compound in Kenya, somehow it's a polygamous society where he has his whole dwelling unit has been oriented in such a direction that you have the place for the sheep and cattle. There's a headman's room, there is a first wife, the second wife, the third wife. So that is how the whole orientation of the dwelling is done. Like Amos Rappaport, he talks about how the monogamous and the polygamous orientations of these dwellings, how, for instance, you have this principal wife, the second wife, the third wife, and you have the kitchen and the sheep. And whereas here it is just a single person, is the head of the family, the wife and children, the grandmother, the calf, place for calf, and the kitchen and the granaries. So it actually how you are positioned in a society and how it defines your small space of a dwelling, your belief systems, how it has to orient your small worship space, how you can actually conduct your processes of your life. So let's take it further, whether it is from the home and how it is situated in the neighborhood or in a street. And this is where we talk about the spaces of life. For instance, in a place like Srirangam, you have the central deity in the center, and you have majority of the Brahman community lives in the immediate concentric rectangle of Srirangam, and then you can see that there's a huge barriers which were constructed from each of these clusters. And so they also have, on the festival occasions, they also have these chariot festivals. They take these chariots and processions along these Uttara and Chitra streets, and how where all these people from different caste, different groups, they come together and participate in these events. Not only with the life, but there is also the aspect of dead, the spaces of dead. Like in my own cultures, where we can see in our hometowns, where on the Pongal day, which is usually coming on January 14th of every year, sometimes it might vary on 15th or so, but what people do is, most of these burial traditions, many of them, they come here, they clean their burial places of their ancestors, they decorate it. So it's a process of maintaining these burial grounds, and once in a year they come together and they identify, and this is one place I think many of the cousins meet there, because that is where the knowledge about who was the dead person and what he likes, and some memories to him, and it has been translated, taken it to as an information to the next generations. So these are the places where the whole town gathers here for certain year celebrations. Kind of on the festive day, they also offer something to the dead. And if you take in a a larger scale, for instance, in the Mexico, where we talk about the altar of dead, which is been in the representative list in the indigenous festivity, and the whole country, whether it is a small child or whether it is families living in abroad, they all travel mostly in the month of October, end of October to November, and they celebrate a particular period for the dead. For instance, there are some days which are dedicated for the people who died with some certain diseases. There are some days which are dedicated for the children. Like that, they travel across, and that is how it has become a part of the the representative list in the UNESCO. And today, all these festivities are getting modified because of various Western influences coming over, because the people who travels abroad and when they come back, they take certain things what they already knew and also what they have experienced in other places. Now, when we talk about the streets, this is an example of Tarangambadi. It's a small fisherman settlements where you can see this is mostly the colonial structures are evident here, and the pre-colonial, which is mainly occupied by the Muslim community, and this is the fisherman community. So in fact, if you ever go to this colonial side, this is where you can see the whole and the grand entrance gateways, the bungalows, the beach bungalow, the Dansburg fort, all these colonial, this is called Kingsway. So it is actually reflected in the way the streets, the scale of the street, the connections with the street. So, but the only connection which actually connects all these communities is the Princess Street. That is where it connects the Hindu, Muslim, and the Christian communities together. And if you look at the pre-colonial houses, this is where you can see the traditional houses where they have and even the fishermen houses. So they have this small veranda outside which faces the street front. And it is also in Tamil culture, they talk about the talking streets. In the evenings they come over and they sit outside and they talk to each other. This is the kind of social interaction one can easily understand from this the nature of the built forms which actually are oriented in the whole street. For example, in this Queen Street, which actually connects all the three communities. But after the tsunami, very few people are walking in this particular street. So now when you scale it up to a village or a town or a city, now for example, you see this photograph of Doha in 1950s, and today what the city of Doha looked like. So what are the determinants of these tremendous changes? Is it only a social change, or it is something, an economic driver? The oil industry has boomed up the economies, and he's brought all the people across the world, and then how different economic institutions have shaped this whole city. So what in 50, in 70 years of the time, this is what we can see the whole transformation. And in contrast with certain traditional settlements, like when we were part of course, we were taken to a place called Lefkara in the Greek part of Cyprus. And this is a small town where all the traditional dwellings are built with the stone walls, and even the streets, you can see that all the stone paved streets. And interestingly, after the war between the Turkish part of the Cyprus and the Greek Turks and the Greeks, so you can see many of the houses are still abandoned. The Turks who were living in the Greek part, they left to the Turkish part. Similarly, the Greeks who were living in the Turkish part, they left to the other side. So now these houses, who owns these houses? They have ownership of it, and many of these houses are left abandoned like that. So there are many issues of how the generational changes, like for example, many of them went into as a bartenders or many other newer income sources. But the traditional, the embroidery work and what the women used to make, so now the youngsters, they are not relying on these traditional livelihoods. So they are trying to, because get attracted with some other jobs in the nearby cities. So in that way, what happens to the village fabric? What happens? So in fact, the perception of what the youngsters perceive about this village and what the elderly people perceive about it, because they have a lot of attachments with this village. So this is where we were doing some studies, and we started giving certain recommendations how we can make some small changes in this particular settlement so that it can sustain with the local economies and it can sustain with the built fabric of this particular place. So let's scale it up further, and when we talk about the state, so earlier in India there's a state of Andhra Pradesh, and recently it has been split into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So now the moment it is split up, obviously when my classmates, when we were studied together in Hyderabad, we all were representing Andhra Pradesh. But today the identity, our slang, our food habits, everything, though we are more or less similar, but slightly the different aspects has been highlighted, and now each one of these states is looking for creating their own identities. Looking at their own cultures, like the way they celebrate the Bonal festivals here and the way they celebrate these Pushkarams here. So all these are actually, the culture plays an important role, how each community could be defined. Here we talk about dividing a state, but how about the Nicosia, a city which is divided between two countries, the Lefkosa on the upper side and the Greek part of Cyprus, which is the Nicosia. So the UN buffer zone actually divides between, and the city is divided between two countries. So which means there is a socio-political influences how people define their own spaces. Now from a monumental level, I think this is one classical example of the Babri Masjid, where whether the Rama has been is an evident source, or the the Babri Masjid was. So there's a lot of conflict which went on, and of course such sites are always there, and some conclusions have been derived in different time, with different possible references. But what we are trying to here to learn about is a sense of place, which is actually a part of the politics of the identity, and it is also a sense of place can be seen as a kind of cultural interpretation, and it is a way how we create a sense of belonging by opposing others' identity. That is also a process. So let me tell you about one more case in Turkey, in Taksim Square, about this Gezi Park. Earlier there used to be an Ottoman times barracks, and an Armenian architect have designed this barracks, and this is the Taksim Square in Istanbul. And in recently the Erdogan's government, they have proposed, they come up with redevelopment, because earlier this has been demolished, the whole barracks has been demolished, and it has been converted as a Gezi Park. And for all these 60 years, this park was evident, and that is one of the large urban green space in the center of Istanbul. And now the new government have brought a proposal that we should build back similar structure of what the Armenian barracks is, So, which has certain impressions from the Indian and the Islamic architecture. And so now when the proposal is brought forward, now see the same people, the people of this particular country, the whole nation have come forward that they made all the protest because they were cutting down some trees. So what we really can understand here is once upon a time that was a pride, but once the same image when it is brought back, how people were responding to these changes. So when you look at the traditions, how they are connected not only at a national level from the intercontinental passages. We talk about Silk Route, we talk about the spice route, people traveled across. So this is one route, like even if you see that there are traditionally people who have come to India, from Afghanistan and other places, and even from the China and Tibetan route. So you have this Uttarapad and Pubnapad and Aparnapad, and we have this Dakshinapad. So here, if you look at it, there's Silk routes, and we have these Indo-Tibetan corridors, where one of my PhD student, Samiksha Srichandan, is currently working on this, documenting these routes, because these are the transhumance routes. So people used to come and collect the salt and everything from from the plain areas, and they used to go to the higher mountain regions, and they used to collect the fruits and vegetables from there. They used to bring it to the plain. So in that way, they used to travel by the donkeys, and they travel for months together to reach to the higher places. That is how the trade routes do exist. So in fact, when all these processes were happening after the 1961 war, so now there has been certain restrictions on these movements, and moreover, now the number of people who are going up and down, because that has gradually reduced. There are many other changes which are happening with the society. One is people are some of them have migrated, some of their houses are still abandoned, and there are still some evident practices, what they brought from the Tibet, whether it is a kind of tangible building elements they have brought, whether they are talking about certain tangible, intangible celebrations, whether it is the festivals they conduct, and which has certain sense of protecting their forest, protecting their farmlands. So each and every intangible associations, with the nature is always to do with the safeguarding this nature. And gradually, when these movements have dropped down, definitely there is certain decline we can see in these tangible and intangible forms. So still one can actually notice that still some families do go, and in fact Samiksha is actually traveling with them, and she's actually documenting all these aspects. And what we are learning here, it is not just only about a community here, and it is when they travel to Tibet, what they take from India to Tibet, and when they travel from Tibet to India, what they bring from here to there. In a similar example, when we talk about the continental spaces, one of our student Indu's work on the production of the refugee place in time, I'll just show you a few glimpses of. As a German exchange student, she was documenting some of the work even in abroad, where we can see the Sri Lankan refugees who have settled for a long time in Paris, how they modified their places even in Paris, how they celebrate their festivals, the local festivals there in the same way. This is where the mediating with the local culture, with the foreign culture, so how they could able to bring these elements into their built forms, with their religious association. So the moment you go to any other place in London like Wembley or East Ham or Southall, you actually can able to relate that the kind of performatives they function and the kind of built fabric that has been adjusted or negotiated with the foreign cultures. So she actually worked on the Tibetan refugees when they migrated to India, and they were initially set up in a tents, and then some of them were taken to Ladakh, some of them were taken to Dehradun, some of them were taken to Karnataka. So like for example, she studied how the same Tibetan group how they settled in Ladakh, how they settled in Dehradun, how they settled in a much remote area in Karnataka. And initially they were given some farmlands, and say because they were the farming backgrounds, and they also from the handicrafts, and they also have this one person from the family they are sent to the monastery to become a monk. So even still it is evident that one of their family member is going to become a monk. So initially when they were given a kind of refugee housing, so how they gradually modified it, and so these are some of the old camps and the new camps, and how they gradually adjusted with this process, and they followed these gunta systems. And so one gunta is about 33 feet into 30 feet, so and about 40 gunta is about 1 acre. So you can see that how initially they were given in a kind of linear layouts, and gradually one after another they started building these the new additions to these next to their neighborhoods. And this is how they started developing. They are actually still continuing certain things what they brought from Tibet. At the same time they are also adjusting with what they are learning from the local regions. So this is where we can see certain elements are still represented in there, whether in terms of monasteries, whether in terms of their temples, all these they are able to reflect. And at the same time addressing the local climatic conditions, whereas in the Tibetan they have these rammed constructions which is not seen here, but whatever the materials they were able to get with the brick and concrete and the tiles, the Mangalore tiles, so that is how they were able to adapt to this. And so what we can actually learn from this case is, so how the local climatic conditions, how the local resources actually people try to negotiate with it, people try to adapt to this, how they can actually enhance the abilities to adapt. So on a overall what we talk about is how an individual becomes a social individual. So we started with where we were born, and then how he started interacting with his organizations, with his workplace, with his state, with his village, with his country, with his nation, with his intercontinental relationships. That is how they are related. So I would like to sum up all these with a nice theoretical understanding what Martin Heidegger talks about in being in time, because it is our body, which is traveling to different places, and our mind is actually understanding those places. At the same time, our mind is taking something what we already know. So this is where actually we talk about what ties the place and the self together, and how much time that engagement is actually tying them. For example, when I was a child, I always loved my hometown, but then when we moved on further different places, so the association with where you are living for more than 20 years, 30 years at another place, so how your definition of home also matters a lot. So who are there in your hometown, who and after 40 years do you still want to go back to your home? What really pulls you back? So these are all very fundamental questions one has to be really looking at, what ties these places. So Heidegger points out that these are constructed, our places are constructed within our memories and our affections, and that are repeatedly encountered and with a very complex associations. And that is where he talks about this complex association of many things which are networked with an individual, and how he prepares himself as a social individual. That process he talks about as a dwelling, is the capacity to achieve a spiritual unity between humans and the things. And let's summarize things. We start with our work as an individual, and we started looking at how our immediate society, whether it is a family or whether it is our village, whether it is town, how it actually defines you, in a way how you interact with that, and how it shapes your culture, how it shapes how you eat, what you eat, how you perform your worship, how you marry, how you obey, everything is defined within your immediate circumstances. And then when you start growing up, obviously when you start interacting with your neighbors, with your friends, with your fellow mates, and what you learn from them, that's again feeding back. At the same time, you again give it back to that, right? And then when you move out for your jobs further, so that is where, when I moved from my hometown, I was always referred to, I came from Nellore, a small town, but then when I moved from Andhra to some other place, I always say I'm from Andhra. When I moved from out of India, I always say I'm from India. When I moved out of India and we were all having some gathering, there was some person who was from Japan, someone from Middle East, someone from Pakistan, then we always say, yes, we are from Asia. So which means we represented certain similarities, though we are differentiated with many other habits, but we were representing one continent when I was studying in London. So this is where both the continental and the intercontinental relationships and how we position ourselves, where and how, is a very complex phenomenon which we really need to understand. And all these associations are reflected in our placemaking processes. I hope you understand this concept, how from the individual and how it relates to the place and its buildings, and how the identity changes with the time. Time is also a major important factor. Thank you very much.